I'm going to read 2 poems, and then I'm going to read a couple of pieces that all of these sort of fit into the theme for tonight, which is family stories. Open, like as my mother says, open the light, or open the water. Was she that aching open? My lovebird waves her wings at me, waves her tail as if an egg is stuck inside that little place. I can see it pulsing. I didn't know the signal for open. She didn't teach me that. Maybe a kiss or a slap or a word that I missed being given from one parent to the other. I saw her sitting in her underwear once on the couch on top of a man, not my daddy. He was completely dressed. She was exhorting him to what? Was that the signal? Or closed, like as my mother says, close the television, or don't forget to put the lock closed before you go to sleep. This piece is called Heart Olympics. I know I'm going to drop everything, so let's start with dropping everything first. Heart Olympics. Love her across space. 6 blocks, 20 blocks, 3 freeway exits, 15 miles in heavy traffic. Expand to points unknown, somewhere green and blue, where sea otters are playing. A voice in a phone booth crackling on the other side of the border, 2 seasons and 3 climates away, where fruit is dripping from a leafy tangle overhead. Love her across time. Good night into a telephone. This morning, she was breathing on your back. A week ago, her face shined across a room. A month passed since she said, goodbye, see you soon. Years of waiting for the gap to narrow because you grew up too late, or she too early. A lifetime of taking lovers as protection from the resentments of unmet need. Love her across boundaries. Through the proper behavior, across vows and loyalties, through walls, doors that will not open, words that can't be said, touch that can't be felt, a chain link fence of judgments, commitments, and proscription. Love her across illusions. Through a flaming wilderness of inequities, of have and want, of time and space, the mirror bright shield surrounding her vulnerabilities and yours, the fine details that blossom in lucid dreams, that frame and pursue your wake time, the fragments of shared feeling lying open like pieces of broken bottles that you step around, until the illusions enter like swords through your heart and come out the other end, and you still love her. Thanks. So I'm going to read a family story. This is called Fire Drill. Sonia, my reborn after the Holocaust mother, pampered her skin with creams and lotions. Her cheeks were soft as ripe peaches. I felt them brush against my face when she grabbed me sometimes, inexplicably, and kissed me. Her wavy black hair flowed back from her temples with a soft rise just above her forehead. She donned stylish, 2-piece suits, pencil skirts that gripped her hips and accentuated her quick, purposeful steps and well-shaped legs. How sexy and fearless she must have been before the war. From a comfortable distance, she had a mildly crooked nose, striking, deep-set hazel eyes, and lips, not quite full, but not too thin either. She would have been considered attractive in that dark, vulnerable, Jewish immigrant sort of way. I learned not to look too closely, too intimately into her face, never directly into her eyes, as one learns to avoid looking into the eyes of a predator in the wild. In my mother's world, patience was not a virtue. People of value didn't wait in lines. Early on, she taught me that people who stood in lines wore the scent of debasement or the stigma of being humiliated. As I watched her navigate the world outside our 4-person family, she played charming one moment, confrontational the next, or suddenly dim and confused if she thought that persona held the best strategy. Only at home or alone with me was she her raw, unsettled, unmodified self. Her lesson to my sister and me was always, your survival depends upon your ability to slip through the cracks, to outwit or outmaneuver those who are in charge. Sonia was born in the Ukraine and taught Russian literature and trigonometry at the age of 16. That's what she told us. When she felt like it, she could recite dozens of pages of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, her favorite novel, from memory. She used her Russian when she didn't want my sister and me to understand the content of her arguments with my father. She was an articulate speaker of several other languages too: Yiddish, the vernacular of daily life, Polish, Ukrainian, German, Czech, Hungarian, and Romanian. 8 languages, she would remind us, when my sister and I cringed at her rendering of English. We lived in an apartment on the 5th floor of 109 Norfolk Street, a red brick building with ancient plumbing and crumbling plaster ceilings. Norfolk Street and the Lower East Side of Manhattan was narrow and deeply pockmarked. On the milder days of winter, I could step through the film of snow and land knee-deep in slush. Our building stood beside a bar. When we climbed down the stairs and emerged onto the street, my mother clasped my hand tightly, steered us around drunks passed out on the sidewalk at the base of our steps, and sitting propped against the handrails, their clothes stained and stinking of urine, she yanked me away from these glazed-eyed men who sometimes asked us for money. My parents would never tell us directly about their slave labor and death camp experiences, or of the demise of our grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, yet we knew that terrible things had happened. I spent years researching our family's history to uncover the few fragments I could find. While my mother was away at nursing school, the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile Nazi killing units, rounded up and murdered the Jewish citizens of her small town of Podvolichiska. Among the dead were my mother's 10-year-old sister, her mother, her grandparents, and the rest of her extended family. My mother went into hiding. She never told us where or how the next disaster unfolded, but a few years later, the Nazi police discovered and seized her, together with her first daughter, Jana, the so smart, so beautiful girl with long, dark hair. As soon as they disembarked from the cattle car to Auschwitz and were shoved into line for selection, her daughter was murdered too. Sonia relived that indelible night, many nights throughout my childhood, sobbing and often screaming uncontrollably. Once in a blue moon, as she liked to say, my mother would speak softly, and turning her eyes away from us, she would paint tender word portraits of her beloved little girl. I came to think of this daughter as my invisible, perfect sibling who would never return and who could never grow up. My father, who met my mother in a displaced persons camp, shared a similar destruction of his family during the Nazi invasion of his small town in Poland. He had been conscripted into the Polish army, and so was not home when the Einsatzgruppen murdered the 2,900 Jews of his town of Domachevo, including my father's parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, his 6 brothers and sisters, and his beloved first wife and young son. And like my mother, my father was later caught and deported to Auschwitz. His pain was the perfect match for my mother's. They were a salt and pepper set of loss and survival. The liquid residues of my parents' grief and rage seeped out and exploded into their interactions with my sister and me. the two after the war children. My mother was particularly volatile, and her hands flew at the slightest provocation, or at no provocation. It wasn't usual for my sister and me to compare my mother's handprints on our faces or other parts of our bodies. These rosy marks were badges of character that my sister and I wore with some embarrassment. Maybe it was because this was the state of things in my household that when I came home crying after a morning of first grade and reported to my mother that the teacher had slapped my face, there was little response. Maybe she assumed that if an adult had disciplined me, I must have deserved it. Even so, in those days, I still looked to my mother for consolation and shelter, but Sonia would rarely make eye contact with me unless she absolutely had to. There was no point. I remained a stranger who wanted something from her: love, approval, tenderness, all things she could seldom provide. She dressed me to suit the weather, kept me clean and fed, shielded me from obvious dangers. Despite this, I held on to the belief that somehow the maternal Sonia could emerge. Our section of Norfolk Street bordered the rear play yard of New York Public School 160, the block square neo-Gothic structure where I spent kindergarten and first grade. When the weather was good, the ecstatic shrieks of children running across the blacktop during lunch and recess lit up the street. These sounds punctuated the ever-present music wheezing out of the kitchen radio inside our flat. My mother sang along, half because she needed to sing, half to block out the neighbors' voices leaking dully through the floors and walls. The sounds of school, home, street, family, strangers, all accordion together. During summer evenings, our Puerto Rican neighbors played instruments and sang songs on the sidewalk below. Their melodies floated up like lullabies through the sweaty, damp, airless air suspended at our open windows. And Sonia's voice filled our rooms too on those nights. On school mornings, I ran downstairs alone and waited in front of the building while my mother leaned out the window 5 stories up and surveyed the street for oncoming cars. When she was satisfied that it was safe, she yelled down for me to run across, and I would race from sidewalk to sidewalk through the school gate to the sea of asphalt where clusters of children, hair brushed, sweaters buttoned, sorted themselves into strands, one behind the other, for the orderly trip to our rooms. Enforcement of the morning queue was assigned to older students. My first goal of the day was to dodge the guardians of order and lines until the last possible moment. During other school day transitions, I cooperated with the concept of lining up the way a baseball runner might point a toe toward second base while edging toward third. I remained vaguely behind the person in front of me, unless something more interesting was going on up ahead. My greater challenge was that standing in line required silence, but nothing could make me hold back my flow of questions and observations. Even though the teacher branded me troublemaker and Mrs. Big Mouth, I couldn't stop talking. Back in our classroom, she slapped my face and tried to shake the noise out of me. When I came home, I described these assaults to my mother, but she did nothing to stop them. Once a month, PS 160 held a fire drill. The bell was ear-splittingly loud, and its cadence was relentless. The alarm could be heard halfway to Delancey Street at the end of the block. We first graders were instructed to stand next to our desk and march single file down the hall, across the playground, and through the opening in the chain-link fence to the street. We were then expected to stand quietly along the sidewalk until the all-clear signaled, like a row of hostages or pint-sized prisoners of war. When the fire bell erupted one early morning, we were lined up and marched toward the gathering spot on Norfolk Street sidewalk, beyond the blacktop and through the gate. I couldn't stand still. It was all too exciting. We were outside, away from those confining desks, out of the glare and drone of that joyless classroom. We were going somewhere. I bounced and wiggled and chattered nonstop. I wanted to see everything, do everything, talk about everything. But no, that was wrong. The teacher screeched, "I told you to be quiet." Her white flower face contorted into a scowl, and I stared at her, terrified, as she shook my shoulders. My mother was home that morning. She was not a woman who spent much time gazing out of windows, so the clamor of the bell and the shouting must have caught her attention. Across the street and below, she must have seen the string of children, and to one side, planted beside the fence, was my teacher yelling and convulsing my 3-foot-tall body. I was still in my teacher's clutches when my mother came racing down 5 flights of stairs out of our building and across the street. My mother was short, exactly 5 feet, the teacher taller by a head, with longer arms and legs and big alien hands. The first thing I remember is the teacher's shocked look when my mother seized her by the throat. Out of my mother's mouth came a barrage of invectives and threats in 2 or 3 of her 8 languages. Some swear words I recognized include Yiddish curses, roughly translated as, "You stupid, hideous bastard." Many more words I didn't understand, but her message was clear. The sentence I remember vividly, she delivered in her most articulate Russian, Yiddish-inflected English. "Next time I'll twist it off." She spit out the word twist, flung it like a knife, as she pinched the woman's nose and with her other hand clutched the woman's white neck. My mother had small, delicate hands, though what she did with them was not so delicate. Her grip was vicious, and I knew from experience the force of her blows. I stood quietly, afraid to move or speak. This wasn't the first time I had seen my mother unleash her fury on someone considerably bigger than herself. I knew to stay out of her way. As the outsized teacher began to shrink, I could feel a nervous smile growing across my lips. The curses continued. Then my mother added, "Don't you ever touch her again." Even though I wasn't the so smart daughter, the real one, the beautiful one with long dark hair, the daughter she couldn't protect, she focused her rage and protected me. The chubby, unruly, too talkative one, the poor replacement, the troublemaker. And now I understand. For a few rare moments, Sonia held her nightmare by the neck and saved her little girl. This is called Natalie, A Little Farewell Love Spell. The title comes from a Laura Nyro song that was a love song to a woman named Emily. This is all true, except for I have to change the names. Natalie Meyer had pale skin, finely chiseled lips, and a shock of black hair that trailed down her back. She wore purple or dark brown nail polish. It was 1969, a year when the LA fashion for most young straight women was crossing the prairie, country girl dresses, or flowing Indian bedspread skirts. Lesbians covered their bodies in oversized flannel shirts and old straight-leg jeans, more patches than pants, held up with suspenders. Natalie dressed like a call girl. Long black wraparound dresses, tight in the bodice, or tight pants, leotards, no bra. She was as smart as she was beautiful. Her first move on me was to ask me to get the book of matches buried in the front pocket of her jeans. She was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a lit Marlboro in the other. Dinner was over, and I wanted a cigarette. She knew I didn't have a light. We were both 16. I had been living in a group home for abused and neglected teens for 6 months. Natalie was the new girl. I had been directed by the staff social worker to look out for her as she got settled. We lived in a place called Hamburger Home on the corner of Hollywood Boulevard and Camino Palmero, a Spanish-style mansion perched temple-like at the top of a broad stone staircase. Once a refuge for homeless immigrant working girls, the residents, named for donors Asher and Hannah Hamburger, sheltered 2 to 3 dozen 12 to 18-year-olds. Most of the girls were called from foster homes and juvenile hall. Some came directly from families who had given up on them. If you attended school or had a job, you could leave during the day. There was a nighttime curfew, but it was erratically enforced by the house mothers. In the evening, while the dining room tables were being cleared, James Brown or Smokey Robinson and the Miracles spun on the turntable downstairs, where the girls transferred in from juvenile hall taught everyone the newest dance steps. Natalie and I ran to my room on the 2nd floor and locked the door. I had myself placed in Hamburger Home when my mother and father became unable to care for me. Their mental state had gotten worse every year. I was afraid to live at home and didn't know how to live on the street. Hamburger Home, the only non-lockup placement in Los Angeles, seemed like a good choice. Natalie, on the other hand, had been labeled incorrigible and sent by her parents against her will. I didn't understand why. She was soft-spoken, and there was a kind of fragility about her. She gave me scented soaps from Spain and left tiny love notes before going out. Compared to the other girls, she seemed sophisticated, especially late in the day when she stepped into her black platform shoes and painted on mahogany lipstick and eye makeup that matched her nail polish. I never knew where she went in the early afternoon when her friend Mo came to pick her up. Mo was similarly attired with a blonde shag. Natalie came home loaded on alcohol and barbiturates, carrying a wad of cash. "I didn't have to do anything for it," she usually said. And I believed her. We made love in my room after the 11:30 bed check, but one night she passed out. "How many downers did you take?" "I don't know, only 3 or 4. "And how many drinks did you have?" "Only a couple." I don't know why I thought to do this, but I ran downstairs, broke into the kitchen, and grabbed a carton of milk. Then I poured a glass of cold milk down her throat and waited. Please, God, I thought, let her throw up. Let her throw up before the mixture of downers and drinks becomes deadly, before the house mother finds out and calls the ambulance, before the police show up and take Natalie to juvenile hall. "Come on, you have to drink this." "No, I'm all right." She was half sitting, half lying on my bed, leaning into me. She fell in and out of sleep, her lips paling. I coaxed her into drinking more milk until she retched and threw up everything in her stomach. I held her and washed her face when she was done, and then cleaned up the mess before anyone found it. Because I was in love with her. Because I had never kissed a woman before I kissed Natalie. Because she asked me to get the matches from her pocket. Looks like we're going over. I have a really short poem. I want to leave us on a slightly more upward trajectory here. And as a bunch of you know that I'm also a musician and have been playing and studying music most of my life. And this piece is called Salsa, and it's a love song to Afro-Cuban music. Oh, and all the Spanish words you're going to hear are names of percussion instruments. Hands on skin, singing out, ga-doo-doo, ga-doo-doo, spinning palito sticks, tapping between the breaths, firm steps of Montuna on piano, bracing each flower of sound like a trellis, timbales crack, a bolt of lightning against tomb boughs, deep moaning, Checere, sizzling, hissing, whispering, bouncing, flying through the air, etching rhythm with each move, bursting above the garden of sound, growing up from the earth, from hands, voices, clave with her strong stalks and thick roots, entwine, cradle, define, deliver. Conga talks, cries, sings. Quinto laughs, shouts out messages. But bass in her sly dance entangles your belly in her syncopations, takes both thighs in her warm grip and won't let go.